The coffee was a bitter but honest thing. It tasted of roasted beans and the institutional steel of the percolator that had been humming in the corner of the Redbird Diner since the Truman administration. Arthur Vance cradled the thick ceramic mug, its warmth a familiar comfort against his palms. Outside, a persistent November drizzle slicked the streets of North River, blurring the neon sign into a smear of crimson and blue on the wet asphalt. The booth's vinyl, cracked like an old map, held him in a way his custom-made furniture never had. It asked nothing of him. He sat in the same booth every morning, back to the wall, a clear view of the door. It was a habit forged in another life, one where knowing who was entering a room was a matter of corporate survival. Here, it was just a way to watch the small world he had chosen wake up. Maria, the owner and sole waitress on the morning shift, moved with an economy of motion that spoke of 30 years on her feet. She refilled his coffee without asking, her smile lined with the same gentle wear as the diner's linoleum floor. "Morning, Art," a voice rumbled from the kitchen pass-through, deep and resonant. "The usual?" Arthur looked up. Ben Carter stood framed in the stainless steel window, a spatula in one hand and a dish towel slung over his shoulder. He was a big man, built of solid, reassuring angles. His dark hair was perpetually tousled, and his forearms, dusted with flour, were a testament to a life of making things with his hands. Ben was the diner's cook, its steady, beating heart. "Morning, Ben, please," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, a little rough from disuse. He did not speak much before his second cup of coffee. Ben nodded, a small smile playing on his lips, and turned back to the grill. A few moments later, a plate slid onto the pass-through counter. 2 eggs, over easy. Bacon, crisp but not burnt. Rye toast, buttered just to the edge. It was exactly the same breakfast Arthur had eaten for the 1,274 days he had lived in this town. He knew the number because he counted things. It was how his mind worked. He had built an empire on counting things. Market shares, risk percentages, human fallibilities. Now he just counted his own quiet days. He ate slowly, savoring the simple perfection of it. Ben cooked the way he did everything else, with a quiet, focused attention that felt like a form of respect. Arthur watched him through the pass-through, a ballet of cast iron and steam. He noticed the small scar above Ben's right eyebrow, a pale crescent against his tanned skin. He noticed the way Ben's shoulders relaxed when the morning rush subsided, the slight dip in his posture that spoke of a fatigue he never mentioned. Arthur filed these details away in the vast, quiet archive of his mind, in a section he never labeled but visited often. His phone, a cheap, featureless device he'd bought at a gas station, vibrated against the table. The screen showed a long string of digits beginning with +41, Zurich. He pressed a button, silencing the call, and placed the phone face down. It was his lawyer, no doubt, with another quarterly report he had no intention of reading. The numbers on those pages were abstractions, ghosts of a life he had purposefully interred. The weight of the ceramic mug in his hands was more real. Ben emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He slid into the opposite side of the booth, the vinyl groaning in protest. He smelled of coffee and bacon grease and something clean, like sawdust and soap. He placed a mug of his own on the table. They often sat like this after the rush, sharing a comfortable silence that felt more nourishing than most conversations Arthur had ever endured. "Heard Eleanor's in a tight spot," Ben said, his voice low. He didn't look at Arthur, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "That developer fellow was back yesterday. Thorne." Arthur's fork paused over his plate. Eleanor Vance, no relation, a coincidence that had amused him when he first arrived, owned The Printed Page, an antique bookstore and town institution on Main Street. It was a dusty, magical place that smelled of aging paper and leather binding. "I saw his car," Arthur said, a black German sedan that looked like it had been sculpted from polished obsidian, utterly alien against the backdrop of worn brick and faded awnings. "He's buying up the whole block," Ben continued, his thumb tracing the rim of his mug. "Making offers nobody can really refuse. But Eleanor, that shop is her whole life, her family's life." Arthur knew. He had spent hours in that shop, running his fingers over worn spines, breathing in the quiet history. He had bought a few paperbacks, always paying in cash, feeling like a thief for not buying more. His apartment held only a dozen books, but he had a private library in Geneva that housed first editions worth more than the entire town of North River. The irony was a constant low-grade hum in the back of his mind. "She won't sell," Arthur stated. It wasn't a question. "She's trying not to," Ben corrected gently, "but he's squeezing her. Called in her business loan from the bank he's now a majority partner in. He's forcing a liquidation auction of her stock to cover the debt. A public auction. It's cruel." Arthur felt a familiar coldness seep into his chest. It was the feeling he used to get before a hostile takeover. The clinical assessment of an opponent's strategy, the identification of a vulnerability being ruthlessly exploited. He had been the exploiter for decades. He had perfected the art. Now, sitting in a small-town diner, he was on the other side, watching a predator circle someone he considered a neighbor. "That's not business," Arthur said, the words tasting like ash. "That's a public execution." Ben finally looked at him, his dark eyes holding a deep, weary anger. "That's Marcus Thorne. He sees this town as a fixer-upper, a blank canvas for his next luxury condo monstrosity." Ben shook his head. "He looks at people like Eleanor, like us, and he doesn't see people. He sees inventory." The word hung in the air between them. Inventory. Arthur had used that word himself. He had liquidated companies, broken them down into assets on a balance sheet. He had never once thought about the faces behind the numbers. He had told himself it was just business. Hearing it now from Ben, in this place that had become his sanctuary, it sounded like a damnation. He looked down at his plate. The simple, perfect breakfast suddenly seemed impossible to finish. The cost of his anonymity had always been inaction. He could watch the world, but he could not touch it. Now, the world was touching back, and he was beginning to understand the price of staying hidden. The developer, Marcus Thorne, moved through North River like a virus. He was all sleek surfaces and expensive cologne, his voice a smooth, condescending purr that made Arthur's teeth ache. He set up a temporary office in the old bank building, its marble floors clicking under his Italian leather shoes. His presence was a disruption, a discordant note in the town's quiet rhythm. Thorne's strategy was brutally effective. He didn't just make offers, he created an atmosphere of inevitability. He talked of revitalization and progress, but his eyes saw only demolition and profit margins. He targeted the oldest businesses first, the ones with aging owners and precarious finances. A whisper here, a legal notice there, a sudden building inspection that uncovered a dozen new code violations. He was a master of the slow, suffocating squeeze. Arthur watched it all from his self-imposed periphery. He saw the for sale signs appear like fungal blooms on properties that had been in the same families for generations. He heard the worried murmurs at the post office, the fearful silences in the diner. This place he had chosen for its stability, for its resistance to the churn of the outside world, was being dismantled from the inside out. And the heart of the resistance, the symbolic center of the fight, was Eleanor's bookstore. One afternoon, Arthur was in the hardware store, comparing the heft of two different hammers. He was helping Ben rebuild the fence behind the diner, a simple, satisfying task that involved sweat and splinters and no quarterly reports. He was examining the grain on a hickory handle when Thorne entered, speaking loudly into his phone, a Bluetooth device blinking in his ear like a malevolent insect. "No, the zoning is a formality," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the high-ceiling space. "Once we clear out this dead wood, the council will roll over. They always do." "Money talks, Henderson. It's the only language these people understand." Arthur felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He kept his back to the man, focusing on the hammer. He was nobody, a quiet man named Art who fixed fences. That was the armor he wore. Thorne paced past the aisle of nuts and bolts, oblivious to anyone but the voice in his ear. As he turned, he bumped squarely into Arthur, knocking the hammer from his hand. It clattered to the concrete floor. Thorne didn't even flinch. He glanced down at Arthur, his eyes taking in the worn flannel shirt, the faded jeans, the scuffed work boots. It wasn't a look of apology. It was a look of assessment, followed by immediate dismissal. He saw a man who was part of the scenery, as inconsequential as a crack in the pavement. "Watch where you're going," Thorne snapped before turning his attention back to his call. He stepped over the fallen hammer and continued toward the front of the store, his voice booming again. "Right, as I was saying, the preliminary architectural sketches are phenomenal." Arthur stood perfectly still for a long moment. The casual, unthinking contempt was more potent than any direct insult. In his old life, men like Thorne had trembled when he entered a room. They had studied his moods, parsed his every word for hidden meaning. To be looked at and seen as nothing, it was precisely what he had wanted. He had craved the invisibility, the freedom from the weight of his own name. But he had not anticipated how it would feel to be dismissed not as a choice, but as a fact, to be considered irrelevant. He bent down and picked up the hammer. The hickory was smooth and solid in his hand. He felt the weight of it, the potential energy it contained. For years, his power had been abstract. Numbers on a screen, clauses in a contract, the silent, crushing force of capital. This was different. This was tangible. His internal conflict, once a philosophical debate, was now a visceral, burning thing. To act was to risk everything he had built here. It meant sacrificing the quiet peace, the simple friendship with Ben, the precious gift of being just art. If he revealed himself, he would once again become Arthur Vance, a name that was a brand, a weapon, a headline. People would look at him differently. Ben would look at him differently. The thought was a physical pain, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. But to do nothing? To stand by and watch Marcus Thorne bulldoze this town, this life, this small pocket of decency he had found. To watch him crush Eleanor, a good woman whose only crime was to love books more than money. To let Thorne's casual, arrogant dismissal be the final word. Wealth was a language he spoke fluently, a country he had long since left. He had convinced himself he was a permanent expatriate. But he knew the words. He knew the terrain. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was the only one who could fight Marcus Thorne on his own terms. He was the only one who spoke the same language. He bought the hammer, paying the teenager at the counter with a crumpled $10 bill. He walked out into the gray afternoon, the tool heavy in his hand, feeling less like a man who had chosen anonymity, and more like a soldier who had forgotten he was holding a gun. The cost of staying hidden was no longer his own peace. It was the survival of the very place that gave him that peace, and that was a price he was no longer sure he was willing to pay. The auction for the contents of The Printed Page was held on a Saturday morning. It felt less like a sale and more like a wake. The cavernous space of the town's community hall was filled with the scent of old paper and Murphy oil soap. Eleanor's life's work was arranged in neat lots on folding tables. Stacks of classic literature, boxes of rare first editions, worn leather armchairs where generations of children had discovered new worlds. Most of the town was there, their faces a mixture of support and sorrow. They came to bear witness, to buy a small piece of what they were losing, a single book to remember what the heart of their town used to be. Eleanor stood near the front, her back ramrod straight, a portrait of quiet dignity in the face of public ruin. She greeted people by name, her smile brittle but genuine. Arthur stood at the very back, leaning against a wall, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. He felt like a ghost at his own funeral. He had the power to stop this farce with a single phone call, to buy the entire collection, the building, the whole damned block. But he remained silent, chained by his own choices. He watched Marcus Thorne stroll in, flanked by two assistants in sharp suits. Thorne didn't look at the books. He surveyed the crowd, his expression one of triumphant amusement. He was not here to buy. He was here to watch. Ben was there too. He stood near the middle of the room, his solid frame a comforting presence. He caught Arthur's eye and gave a small, grim nod. Arthur felt a pang of something he couldn't name, gratitude, shame, a deep and aching loneliness. Ben thought he was here as a friend, another helpless onlooker. The gap between who Ben saw and who Arthur was had never felt so vast, so fraudulent. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from a neighboring county, began the proceedings. The bidding was slow, punctuated by long silences. A local teacher bought a box of children's books. The town librarian secured a set of encyclopedias. Each purchase was a small act of defiance, but it was like throwing pebbles against a tidal wave. Arthur's attention was caught by a single volume displayed on a velvet cloth, a first edition of The Grapes of Wrath, its dust jacket remarkably preserved. It was a book that had shaped his own youth, a story of dignity in the face of dispossession. He felt an irrational pull toward it, a desire to save this one thing from the wreckage. He must have stared too long, because Thorne, making his way through the crowd, noticed his gaze. The developer stopped, a smirk playing on his lips. He followed Arthur's line of sight to the book, and then back to Arthur's face. "Thinking of bidding?" Thorne's voice was slick with condescension, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A bit out of your price range, I'd imagine." He gestured dismissively at Arthur's jacket. "Don't get your hopes up, old man. The cover on that thing is probably worth more than your entire wardrobe." The small circle of people around them fell silent. Heads turned. Arthur felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. It was a primal, forgotten feeling. He had not been publicly humiliated in 30 years. He said nothing, his face a mask of neutrality, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had endured far worse from far more dangerous men. But this was different. This was personal. This was in his home. Before he could even formulate a response, Ben was there. He moved from the crowd with a quiet speed that was surprising in a man his size. He didn't touch Thorne, but he stood squarely between him and Arthur, a human wall. "Leave him alone, Thorne." Ben's voice was low and steady, but it carried an unmistakable threat. It cut through the auctioneer's patter, silencing the room. "He's got more class in his little finger than you've got in your whole wallet." Thorne's smirk faltered. He looked at Ben, at the unyielding set of his jaw, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He was a bully, and bullies only understood strength. He opened his mouth to retort, then seemed to think better of it. With a final, contemptuous sneer at Arthur, he turned and walked away. The auctioneer, flustered, resumed his chant, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The moment had passed, but Arthur was frozen by it. Ben's defense. It was simple, direct, and offered without a moment's hesitation. He hadn't defended a billionaire. He had defended Art, his friend, a quiet man he believed was being treated unfairly. The gesture landed on Arthur with the force of a physical blow. It was a gift of loyalty so pure, so uncalculated, that it broke through decades of carefully constructed cynicism. No amount of money could have bought what Ben had just given him for free. He looked at Ben, who had turned back to him, his brow furrowed with concern. "You all right?" Ben asked, his voice back to its normal, warm tone. Arthur could only nod, his throat tight. He had built an empire to insulate himself from the world, to make himself untouchable. But in that moment, he understood that the only armor that had ever truly mattered was the quiet, unshakable decency of a good man standing at his side. That night, sitting alone in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, the echo of the humiliation had faded, replaced by the ringing clarity of Ben's words. He looked at the cheap burner phone on his kitchen table. The decision was no longer a conflict. It was a duty. He didn't pick up the phone out of ego or for revenge. He picked it up because Ben Carter had stood up for a man who had nothing. And Arthur Vance, the man who had everything, would not let that stand. He would not let Ben's faith in him be misplaced. He made the call. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of Art, the quiet neighbor. It was the voice that had moved markets and toppled titans, a voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. The game had changed. The first move was silent, invisible. A single encrypted email sent from a public library computer 2 towns over. It contained a meticulously researched, deeply unflattering dossier on Marcus Thorne's previous development projects. The cut corners, the environmental violations, the trail of lawsuits from disgruntled investors. The email was sent to the lead financing partner for the North River project, a cautious, old money firm in Boston. It was sent from a shell entity, a ghost in the machine. Within 48 hours, Thorne's primary funding was suspended pending a due diligence review. The news didn't make the local paper, but Arthur knew. He had systems that monitored the flow of capital the way meteorologists monitored the weather. The second move was a phone call. Arthur used a voice modulator, a relic from a particularly contentious negotiation in his past. He spoke to a notoriously aggressive, semi-retired building inspector he had once employed to vet his own construction sites. He didn't ask for favors. He simply provided an anonymous tip about potential structural and safety code discrepancies in Thorne's flagship hotel in the city, citing specific technical flaws that only an expert would know to look for. The inspector, smelling a juicy, high-profile violation, was on site the next morning. Thorne's hotel was suddenly wrapped in red tape, its operations crippled by a stop work order. While these larger gears were turning, Arthur engaged in smaller, more personal acts of quiet rebellion. He learned from Maria at the diner that her son's recent hospital stay had left her with a mountain of debt. A week later, an anonymous donation was made to the hospital's patient assistance fund, a donation that precisely matched her outstanding bill. She received a letter informing her the debt was cleared. She cried at the counter, telling Ben it was a miracle. Arthur drank his coffee and said nothing, the warmth of the mug doing little to warm the cold knot of deception in his gut. He arranged for an anonymous grant to be given to the town library, earmarked for the acquisition of historically significant local collections. The librarian, ecstatic, immediately contacted Eleanor, offering to purchase a significant portion of her remaining unsold stock at fair market value. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a lifeline. Thorne began to look harried. The confident swagger was replaced by a tense, hunted energy. He was on his phone constantly, his voice no longer a condescending purr, but a frustrated bark. He was fighting a war on multiple fronts against an enemy he couldn't see. He saw bureaucratic obstacles, bad luck, a sudden string of misfortunes. He never once considered that the source of his problems was the quiet, irrelevant man he had insulted at the auction. People like Thorne never looked down for the source of their troubles. They only looked up. But Arthur's secret war came at a cost. The long hours spent on encrypted laptops, the clandestine trips to other towns, the constant mental calculations, it all took a toll. He became distracted, his presence at the diner less a quiet retreat and more a brief stop for fuel. Ben noticed. Of course, Ben noticed. He had a way of seeing things others missed. One morning, as Arthur was staring into his coffee, lost in thought about a legal loophole in commercial zoning law, Ben slid into the booth. "You seem a million miles away, Art," Ben said softly. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Arthur blinked, forcing himself back to the present. The smell of coffee, the hum of the cooler, the comfortable presence of his friend. "Just a lot on my mind," he said, the evasion feeling clumsy and false on his tongue. "Anything you want to talk about?" Ben asked, his gaze steady. "No, it's nothing," Arthur lied. Ben didn't push. He just nodded slowly, a flicker of something, disappointment, maybe hurt, in his eyes before he masked it. He changed the subject, talking about the new fence they had finished, but a subtle distance had opened between them. It was a small fracture in the foundation of their friendship, a silence that was no longer comfortable, but filled with the things Arthur wasn't saying. The casual intimacy they shared, the easy back and forth, was strained. Arthur found himself censoring his thoughts, guarding his words. He was so focused on protecting the town that he was damaging the one relationship that made the town worth protecting. The irony was devastating. He was winning the war for North River, but he felt, with a certainty that terrified him, that he was losing Ben. And that was a loss he knew, even with all his billions, he could never afford. Marcus Thorne, cornered and bleeding capital, made a final, desperate move. He leveraged his remaining influence at the bank to force a foreclosure auction on the entire block of properties he had coveted, including Eleanor's building. It was an act of scorched earth capitalism. If he couldn't develop the properties, he would own them, bleed them dry, and let them rot as a monument to his power. The auction was held in the town hall, the same room where Eleanor's books had been sold off. The mood this time was not sorrowful, but tense, a low hum of communal dread in the air. Nearly everyone from North River was there, standing along the walls, their arms crossed, watching the final act of their town's hostile takeover. Arthur sat in the last row, in the same spot he had occupied before. He wore the same worn jacket. He was, to all appearances, the same man. But inside, a lifetime of ice-cold composure was holding a hurricane at bay. Ben was there too, standing near the front with Eleanor and a small group of other local business owners. He didn't look back at Arthur. The distance between them felt like a chasm. Thorne stood at the front, a predatory smile plastered on his face. He believed he had weathered the storm. He believed this was his victory. The auctioneer, the same man as before, began the proceedings. He read the legal descriptions of the properties, his voice flat and funereal. He opened the bidding. A local consortium, hastily assembled and underfunded, made a brave first bid. Thorne, without even looking at them, countered with a figure that was twice as high. A gasp went through the room. The consortium huddled, whispered, and offered a small increase. Thorne laughed, a short, ugly sound, and raised his own bid by $1 million. It was over. The room fell into a defeated silence. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Going twice." He never got to 3. From the back of the room, a woman's voice, calm and clear, cut through the tension. "The bid is $20 million. Every head in the room turned. A woman in a severe dark gray suit stood near the door. She held a numbered paddle. No one had seen her come in. She looked like she belonged in a Manhattan boardroom, not a small town hall. Thorne spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, forgetting all auction protocol. "My name is Catherine Hayes," she said, her voice impassive. "And my client bids $20 million. Thorne's face flushed with anger. He snarled a new number. $22 million. "25, Ms. Hayes replied instantly, without blinking. The battle was on. It was no longer an auction. It was a bludgeoning. Thorne, driven by ego, would shout a number, and Catherine Hayes, with the placid calm of someone with infinite resources, would counter before he had finished speaking. The price climbed to figures that were meaningless, absurd. 30 million, 35. The townspeople watched, their mouths agape, as two titans fought over their home. Finally, at $40 million, Thorne faltered. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His face was pale. He looked at his assistant, who shook his head frantically. He was tapped out. $40 million from Mr. Thorne, the auctioneer said, his voice trembling slightly. "Do I hear 41? "50, Catherine Hayes said, as if ordering a cup of coffee. A collective sigh went through the room. It was done. Thorne stared at her, his chest heaving. He was broken. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel down with a crack that made everyone jump. "To paddle number 72. Thorne, utterly undone, stormed toward the woman. "Who is your client?" he raged, his voice cracking. "Who is the North River Group? Who did this?" Catherine Hayes looked at him, her expression unreadable. Her gaze then drifted deliberately over his shoulder to the back of the room, to the quiet man in the last row who had not moved, had not spoken, had not even stood up. "Our principal prefers his privacy," she said, her voice carrying in the silent room. "But he insisted on being present. He's been here the whole time." Thorne, confused, followed her gaze. He saw the worn jacket, the faded jeans, the quiet, unassuming man he had dismissed as a nobody. He saw Art. The color drained from his face as the impossible truth rearranged his entire world. The man he had mocked, the man he had stepped over, the man he had deemed worthless, had just casually, quietly, and completely destroyed him. A murmur swept through the hall as people followed Thorne's stunned gaze. They saw their quiet neighbor, Art, and they saw the truth. Later that night, Arthur found Ben at the diner. It was long past closing time, the chairs stacked on the tables, the grill cold. The only light came from the humming neon sign outside. Ben was sitting in their booth, a solitary figure in the gloom. Arthur slid into his usual spot. The vinyl was cold. The silence was heavier than any he had ever known between them. He waited. Ben didn't look at him for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its usual warmth. "You could have told me." Arthur's carefully prepared words, his explanations about security and privacy, died in his throat. They were hollow, meaningless. "It's not the money, Art," Ben continued, finally turning to face him. The hurt in his eyes was a physical thing, a blade twisting in Arthur's chest. I don't care about the money. It's that you didn't trust me. You sat here day after day, and you let me believe you were someone else. You thought the truth would change things. You thought it would change me. I was afraid it would, Arthur admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I was afraid of losing this. He gestured vaguely at the booth, the diner, the shared space between them. This is the only thing that's been real in my life for a very long time. It's the only thing I couldn't bear to lose. Ben looked at him, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back every layer of defense Arthur had ever constructed. This was real because we were real, Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. It had nothing to do with what was in your wallet. And if you couldn't see that, then you never really knew me at all. The words struck Arthur with the force of a final judgment. He had won the town. He had vanquished the villain. And in the process, he had broken the one thing he had fought to protect. He had nothing left to say. He could only sit in the ruins of his own deception, the richest and most profoundly lonely man on earth. The aftermath was a strange, disorienting fog. Marcus Thorne vanished overnight, his temporary office emptied, his expensive car gone. The properties were safe, transferred into a newly formed community trust that Arthur had quietly established, with Eleanor Vance and other local leaders on the board. North River was saved, but Arthur Vance was lost. His anonymity, the carefully constructed shelter he had lived in for years, had been obliterated. People in town now looked at him with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a profound, unbridgeable distance. They were no longer his neighbors. He was their benefactor. When he walked into the general store, conversations would halt. When he sat at the diner, Maria would fuss over him, refusing to let him pay. He was no longer art. He was a symbol, a myth, a walking bank account. He had never felt more isolated. Worst of all was the silence from Ben. The diner booth remained empty. For 2 days, Arthur went at the usual time, sitting alone, the space opposite him a gaping void. The coffee tasted like ash. The silence was an accusation. The diner, once his sanctuary, felt like a museum exhibit of a life he used to have. The booth had doubled in size, and he had shrunk to fill it. He felt the loss of their shared routine like a phantom limb, a constant, dull ache where something essential used to be. On the third morning, he almost didn't go. The thought of sitting in that empty booth again was too much to bear, but the habit was too deeply ingrained. He walked through the drizzling rain, pushed open the diner door with a sense of dread, and stopped. Ben was there. He was sitting in their booth, on his usual side, staring out the window. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He walked slowly, uncertainly, toward the table. He slid into his seat. The vinyl was still cold, but the air felt different, less heavy. Ben didn't speak for a full minute. He just continued to watch the rain. Then, without looking at Arthur, he pushed a thick ceramic mug across the table. It was filled with coffee, black, just the way Arthur liked it. Arthur wrapped his hands around it. The warmth was a tentative truce. Finally, Ben turned his head. He looked directly at Arthur, his gaze clear and steady. The hurt was still there, in the deeper lines around his eyes, but it was overlaid with something else. Resignation, acceptance, and something that looked like a choice. "So," Ben said, his voice a low rumble, the first words spoken between them in 2 days. "The community trust needs a new fence for the park. The old one's falling apart." Arthur looked at him, confused. I can fund that. I'll make a call." "I know you can," Ben said, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But that's not what I asked." He held Arthur's gaze. "I asked if you knew anyone who can swing a hammer." The question hung in the air between them. It was everything. It was an offering, a test, and a path back. He wasn't asking the billionaire for a check. He was asking Art if he still knew how to work, how to be a neighbor, how to be a friend. He was offering Arthur a chance to rebuild not just a fence, but the very foundation of who he was in this town, in this life. A wave of relief so profound it felt like a physical impact washed over Arthur. It was a release of pressure he hadn't even realized he was carrying. His vision blurred, and he blamed the steam rising from the coffee. He could only nod, unable to trust his voice. Ben nodded back, a simple, solid gesture of understanding. He took a sip of his own coffee. The silence that settled between them was different now. It was not the easy, unthinking comfort of the past, nor the painful, charged silence of the last few days. It was something new, a quiet space built on a truth that was finally known, a foundation that had been tested and had, miraculously, held. A week later, they stood side by side in the weak afternoon sun, the scent of damp earth and freshly cut cedar in the air. They were building the fence for the park. Arthur's hands, soft from years of disuse, were already blistering, but he didn't care. The rhythmic thud of his hammer against the nails was a kind of prayer. He was just a man building a fence, next to another man building a fence. They worked for an hour without speaking, finding their old rhythm in the shared task. The comfortable silence had returned, deeper and more durable than before. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the grass, Ben paused, leaning on his hammer. He looked at the line of new posts, straight and true, and then he looked at Arthur. "You know," Ben said, his voice quiet, meant only for Arthur, "I saved your seat. I always save your seat." Arthur stopped hammering. He looked at his friend, at the man who had seen past the flannel shirt to the person underneath, and then seen past the billions to the same exact person. Ben wasn't just talking about a booth in a diner. He was talking about a place in the world, a place that was still there for him if he was willing to show up and do the work. Arthur smiled, a real smile, the first one in a long time. It felt like breaking new ground. "I know," he said, and for the first time, he truly believed it. He was known now, not for the fortune he had made, but for the home he had chosen, and the friend he had refused to lose. And that, he understood, was the only wealth that had ever truly mattered.